Hi, my name is Dannielle Davis.
My name is Liz Gallup, and we're going to be talking about domestic violence and military sexual trauma within the military. Currently in the military, women only make up 15% of the active duty, 17% of the National Guard and Reserve, but they account for 95% of the sex crime victims within the military. Of the 3,374 reported cases of military sexual trauma, only 7% are successfully convicted.
Within the United States, according to a 60 Minutes report of War at Home, rates of domestic violence were 5 times higher in military families than in civilian ones. So this has clearly become a huge domestic problem. So as we realize that this is a domestic problem, we have to look into the military itself. Domestic violence and the military, we were looking at a huge popular notice within the media, how 60 Minutes brought in a report to actually bring light to the domestic violence concern within the United States. At their program War at Home, they showed about the rates of violence, domestic violence within military families, and how it's 5 times higher than civilian families. With this concern being brought to the public's eyes, it brought a whole lot of legislation into existence.
One of the key things that we realized through our research on domestic violence and military sexual trauma is that the military structure plays a huge role in the perpetuation and handling of cases of military sexual trauma and domestic violence. The key structure that impacts women specifically, mostly, is the role of the commander. So the commander of the unit has the full discretion to take allegations of military sexual trauma and domestic violence to a court system. They have the responsibility of determining whether or not allegations are well-founded and whether or not these allegations can be prosecuted. When we looked at the military structure, the main thing that we both realized was that the role of the commander really impacts the ability for victims of military sexual trauma and domestic violence to come forward. The military structure has the commander as the head of the unit. As the head of the unit, the commander has the ability to decide whether or not allegations are well-founded and whether or not these cases should be brought to a military court system. The problem with the commander is that the majority of commanders are men, and the majority of the victims of military sexual trauma and domestic violence are women. Of the commanders currently in the military, only 1 of 38 4-star generals or admirals are women. The difficulty with having men in positions of power and women being victims is that there's a difficulty in investigating possible victims. Victims are hesitant to come forward and to confront males and open up about what they experienced. And the other difficulty is that sometimes the commanders are perpetrators of violence against women in the instances of military sexual trauma and domestic violence. Commanders also have connections to the perpetrators, which makes commanders often hesitant to report instances of military sexual trauma and domestic violence.
This becomes a huge concern because confidentiality is a huge ethical dilemma within this, because there are now policies within the military where confidentiality is being excluded in terms of being able to make sure that people like chaplains who work under confidentiality rules are now being asked to come forward with when someone is in concern, or there's somebody who has been violated and they want to know more information because of chain of command.
In addition, commanders, when they find out about possible allegations, they often confront the person who is being accused of committing sexual acts. And when this happens, word quickly gets around the unit and within the military community about these allegations, and victims can be harassed, they can be accused of telling lies, and that's another deterrent for victims of military sexual trauma and domestic violence coming forward.
At the same time, there's that concern and fear of career consequences as well, Once the chain of command knows, then you have this concern of, am I going to be able to keep my job? Am I going to be dishonorably discharged? Those spheres of personal and workplace become combined, creating a huge problem for those who are conflicted and determine whether or not they are going to actually reveal this problem. Because within the Managing Marines in Distress guide that they have, they're sitting here stating these concerns of they're not coming forward because of these career consequences, or fear that they're going to be ridiculed, or concern about whether or not agencies outside are going to be able to support them.
And all of these issues surrounding the role of the commander and the report of military sexual trauma and domestic violence has led to questions about whether or not the role of commander should be reevaluated. Some suggestions are that commanders should be more trained on how to handle allegations and how to better advise victims of violence. Currently, the military is making a push towards a program called SHARP, which stands for Sexual Harassment, Assault, Response, and Prevention. This program works on training commanders on how to handle instances of violence against military personnel. These military personnel experience sexual assault or harassment, and commanders are hopefully going to be better able to handle cases, maintain confidentiality, and hopefully also neutrality in these cases. The biggest problem though is when these commanders are the offenders. When the commander is the offender, it kind of ruins the chain of command. There's nowhere for these victims to go. They can't go above their commander, and there's very few outside resources that victims can turn to get justice.
And another concern is with the paradigm of who are victims broadening. Now that Don't Ask, Don't Tell has been repealed, there are concerns of whether or not there are victims who are male, victims who are actually within the armed forces, so women personnel who are victims. And then in addition to that, it's no longer just the spouse at home being the victim and it being a male personnel person who is committing it within the home. So at the same time, this education has to be expanded so that way it is more inclusive of these new individuals, so to speak.
And that's a really good point, because a lot of the times when we look at instances of military sexual trauma, there's very few statistics, which makes us assume that men aren't victims of military sexual trauma, but unfortunately men are also victims. It's just, it seems that statistic-wise it's not that prevalent, but most of the reason why the statistics is so low is because men are hesitant to come forward and discuss their sexual assault because of the stigma that men aren't victims of sexual violence, they're only perpetrators of it. And if a man is sexually harassed, there's a huge stigma against them.
And the same applies to domestic violence, whether they are civilian or within the military, because there's this shaming process that they go through in terms of being able to reveal that yes, they have been a victim of such. So it's something that's growing and it cannot be ignored because it is underreported within the civilian world as well as the military personnel.
Yeah.
So from here, now we have to look at what can they do if they remove the chain of command as the way of reporting.
Yeah, and currently there's a huge push for legislation that removes the chain of command entirely from the process of investigating and handling cases of military sexual trauma and domestic violence. But the question is, if the commander is no longer in charge of investigating these instances of violence, who will be? And some people recommend that a criminal investigation office in the military should investigate. This removes the chain of command and hopefully, allows some sort of confidentiality and more neutrality in cases of violence. There's also a bigger push for programs and resources outside of the military unit and the military structure. Some military community programs or victim advocacy programs and programs within the Marine Corps.
Some of the programs exist within the Victim Advocacy Program. They also have the Marine Corps One Source program. It's a place for them to get guidelines and how to continue on with what happens and what resources are available to them. So some they promote are actually national resources, including the National Domestic Violence Hotline, the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence. Within the office itself, they have a wake support group for women, but the concern is where are men victims, male victims, being able to go. There is no source for male victims to go. So those are major concerns. With all of these national resources available, the question becomes whether or not it can actually trickle down to those within the military and making sure that it still remains a confidential process for them. So at the end of the day, we need to really understand what possibilities are out there for military servicemen and women to where they feel safe and secure to be able to report victimization. So at the end of the day, we have laid out many facts about this concern of the chain of command. And now the question becomes, where do we go from here?